All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into a topic that's got some serious heat around it. This whole idea of a war on petrolheads. We've got this opinion piece we're looking at, and it's really more like a full-blown rant about all the stuff car enthusiasts are up against these days. Some pretty strong opinions in there, so we're going to try to unpack them a bit and see what's what.
Yeah, it really digs into this feeling that a whole community is under attack, you know? Like it goes way deeper than just cars. It's about a whole way of life, a passion, and it feels like someone's trying to stomp it out.
For sure.
Mm.
And one of the big things they're fired up about is all these environmental policies. They use this example like, imagine you're cruising through London in your classic Ford Escort, just soaking up those vintage vibes. And bam, you get hit with a 12.50-pound charge just for driving in the city.
That's the ultra low emission zone, the ULEZ they call it. They just expanded it to cover the whole greater London area. And yeah, the goal is to make the air cleaner, and studies do show it's working. But for people who own older cars that don't meet the standards, it's a real kick in the wallet. It makes you think, how do we balance those environmental goals with the reality of owning a car, especially for people who can't just go out and buy a new one?
And it's not just London, right? The whole UK planned to ban new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. That's got a lot of petrol heads feeling pretty anxious.
Definitely adds to that feeling of being squeezed.
This rant argues that the push for electric vehicles, even if it comes from a good place, is kind of like a one-size-fits-all approach. Like it ignores other options that might be out there. They specifically call out biofuels as an example, something that maybe deserves a closer look.
Yeah. Is it possible we're getting tunnel vision on this all electric future and missing some other paths we could be taking?
They make a strong point about the financial side of things, too. Like retrofitting a classic car to meet those emission standards can set you back thousands of pounds. Then you add in the rising fuel costs and all those taxes tied to owning a car. Suddenly, having a petrol car feels less like a right and more like you got to be loaded to afford it.
Definitely plays into all that anxiety people have about how much it costs to live these days. But some economists would say this shift is necessary. Like, they argue that the true cost of owning a petrol car, the environmental impact included, has been swept under the rug for way too long. Big question is, will this transition be fair and manageable for everyone, or will it hit some communities way harder than others?
And this rant digs into the cultural side, too. Like they say, the spaces for car enthusiasts are shrinking. Those weekend car meets the fun of hanging out in the garage, tinkering the thrill of a perfectly tuned engine. The rant says those experiences are getting harder and harder to find.
There's definitely a lot of stuff happening at once there. Zoning restrictions, noise regulations, even just the fact that there are fewer and fewer petrol stations, all of that changes the landscape for car enthusiasts. Plus, there's this feeling that petrol heads are being made out to be the bad guys, like they're the villains in this fight against climate change.
They even threw out a statistic. Apparently, classic cars, the ones that people cherish and usually barely drive, only make up like 0.2% of total road emissions. They got that from the Federation of British Historic Vehicle Clubs. So is it fair to target this group when they're having such a tiny impact?
It makes you wonder about priorities, like where should we really be focusing our efforts when it comes to cutting down emissions?
They bring up something else that's pretty worrying, too. These scrappage schemes that are supposed to help reduce emissions, but they've also ended up destroying some cars that were actually culturally important.
Imagine a world without the iconic Ford Cortina, or even the quirky little Austin Allegro.
It's a tough situation, right? Trying to balance doing something good for the environment with protecting history and all these passions that people have.
It really is a complex situation, and there's no easy answers. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with a bunch of missing pieces. But it shows how important it is to have a conversation that's more, thoughtful and takes everyone's feelings into account. We got to acknowledge the passion and the worries of these petrol heads while still figuring out how to deal with this climate crisis.
Right. And that leads us to another part of this rant, what they call the EV problem, but specifically from the petrol head's point of view.
It says that, yeah, electric vehicles, they have their good point, but it argues that the whole system to support them just isn't there yet, especially if you don't live in a big city. Like, imagine you're a petrol head out in the countryside where there aren't many places to charge an EV. Would you really feel okay getting rid of your trusty petrol car for one of those?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If you can't even charge the thing reliably, it's hard to see how switching makes any sense. But haven't there been studies showing that in the long run, owning an EV can actually be cheaper than a petrol car? Does that play into this whole EV problem thing?
Oh, yeah, that's a big debate for sure. People who are all for EVs, they love to point out that you spend less on running them and you can save money over time. But that initial price tag is a huge obstacle, especially with EVs costing what they do right now. And then there's the whole question of whether you can even find a place to charge the thing, which really depends on where you live.
This rant gets into the emotional side of driving, too, something that I think really resonates with a lot of petrol heads. It says that EVs just lack a certain soul. You know that feeling of a roaring engine, the way you connect with a manual gearbox, that bond between the driver and the machine?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Is it just nostalgia, or is there something really fundamentally different about driving an EV? Some people say that the instant torque and the quiet power of electric motors give you a whole different kind of thrill. Others say nothing beats the sound of a well-tuned combustion engine.
It's like comparing apples and oranges, I guess. Both give you a driving experience, but they're just totally different beasts. But wouldn't you agree that the technology is changing so fast? Maybe as EVs keep developing, we'll see features that are more geared toward driving enthusiasts, like simulated engine sounds, or even something that makes it feel like you're shifting gears in a manual transmission.
It's definitely possible. We've already seen some car companies trying things like that, trying to find that sweet spot between what's familiar and what's brand new. It shows how important it is to have innovation that works for all kinds of drivers with different tastes.
And then the rant takes kind of a sharp turn. It starts questioning the motives behind this whole push for electric vehicles. They use the phrase corporate hypocrisy and say that the really big polluters like the shipping industry and airlines aren't getting the same kind of attention as regular people driving their cars.
You hear that a lot. The idea that we're focusing so much on what individuals are doing that we're missing the bigger picture, the need for real systemic change. The rant even brings up the environmental impact of making lithium-ion batteries, which are essential for EVs. So yeah, EVs themselves might be cleaner to drive, but digging up all those materials and making those batteries definitely has consequences for the environment.
It's not as clear-cut as it seems then. There are trade-offs and complications to think about. But wouldn't you say that focusing only on the negative side of EV production ignores the good that could come out of it? Battery technology is getting better all the time, and there's more and more investment in making the whole process of mining and recycling more sustainable.
Absolutely. We have to look at the whole life cycle of a product, not just one little piece of it. And it's true that this push for EVs is driving all kinds of innovation and investment in cleaner technologies, and that could have benefits way beyond just the car industry.
This rant also hints at there being some kind of political agenda behind these policies. Like they suggest that things like expanding the ULEZ are more about bringing in money than they are about actually cutting down emissions.
It taps into a feeling a lot of people have, that these environmental policies are sometimes being used for other things, whether it's making money or scoring political points. But it's important to remember that just because you're skeptical of certain policies doesn't mean you have to be skeptical of the environmental issues themselves.
Right. It's good to be critical of how things are done, but that doesn't change the fact that we need to deal with climate change.
Exactly. And it brings us back to the need for a conversation that's more nuanced and understanding.
Yeah.
How do we find solutions that actually work and that are fair to everyone? Solutions that protect the planet, but also respect different opinions and make sure that individuals and communities aren't getting hurt.
Yeah, it's a tough one for sure. Trying to find that balance. But this whole discussion, it made me think of something I read a while back about future nostalgia.
Future nostalgia, huh? That's an interesting way to put it. What's that all about?
It's this idea that we can still appreciate things from the past, even as we're moving forward. You know, like we can look back and enjoy the sound of a V8 engine without rejecting the quiet efficiency of an electric motor.
I get it. So it's not about picking one or the other. It's more about recognizing that technology and culture, they're always changing.
Exactly. Maybe in a few decades, we'll look back on these early EVs with the same kind of fondness we have for classic cars now.
You could have future car enthusiasts geeking out over a perfectly preserved Tesla Model S from like the early 2020s. Maybe they'll even have rallies for vintage EVs, showing off their restored electric cars and reminiscing about the good road days of instant torque and regenerative braking.
Now, that's a future I'm on board with. So to wrap things up on this whole war on petrolheads, it's clear that it's a lot more complicated than it might seem on the surface.
It's not just a fight between the old and the new or between car lovers and environmentalists. There are good points on both sides.
On one hand, we've got this urgent need to cut down emissions and find ways to get around that are better for the planet. But we also have to think about the impact on culture, what it would mean to lose some of our automotive history, and the worries of a whole community that feels like it's being pushed aside.
The big takeaway for me is that we need to talk to each other. We need to understand where everyone's coming from and find ways to bridge the gap between people who seem to be on opposite sides.
It's not about making anyone the bad guy or ignoring their concerns. It's about having a real conversation about the challenges and the possibilities that are out there.
At the end of the day, it's about finding solutions that work for everyone. Solutions that protect our planet, respect our history, and let us keep enjoying the thrill of driving, whether it's powered by petrol, electricity, or something we haven't even thought of yet.
Well said. So to all you listeners out there, we'll leave you with this. What do you think the future of car culture looks like? Can we find that balance between keeping traditions alive and embracing progress? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, happy driving.
Shout out time, guys. Thank you so much. Hey, if you enjoy my content, why not get involved? Buy me a coffee. You can do that at either of these links. Or if you're watching on YouTube, buy me a thanks or take out a membership. It all helps. It really does.